A light drizzle fell on the fresh grave, mingling with the tears of mourners gathered around. Despite the umbrellas, the air carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. The husband stood closest to the grave, his face a mask of somber grief. He clutched the black-rimmed hat in his hands, squeezing it as if it held all his bottled emotions. His wife's funeral was not supposed to be like this. It was supposed to be a quiet farewell, but whispers were already circulating through the small crowd. Eyes glanced sideways at him, darting between his stiff posture and the woman standing just beyond the mourner's circle, his mistress. Her presence wasn't acknowledged by anyone, but she was there, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid confrontation. She wore dark sunglasses, her lips pressed into a thin line, and a veil of uncertainty shrouded her features. Did she regret coming? Did she worry about the eyes that judged them both silently? The priest's voice was solemn, reading passages of scripture that barely pierced the fog of thoughts swirling in the husband's mind. As the service came to an end and people began to drift away, the husband remained by the grave, watching as the first shovel of dirt hit the coffin. Each dull thud felt like another reminder of his impending reality. His wife was gone, and soon enough, her legacy and her wealth would become a battle he wasn't prepared to fight. Just as the final mourner left, his mistress approached. Her hand brushed his arm, and they exchanged a brief look, one that held the weight of everything unsaid. No words passed between them, not here, not now, but the tension between them simmered, ready to spill over when they were away from the watchful eyes of the community. Tomorrow would be the reading of the will, a formality, or so he thought. His wife's death had been sudden, but surely everything had been left to him, her loving husband. What could possibly go wrong? The air inside the notary's office was heavy, almost stifling. The husband sat stiffly across from the family lawyer, his mistress beside him, a few steps removed but present nonetheless. The small room, with its dark wood panels and shelves lined with thick law books, felt suffocating. The husband's gaze never left the lawyer as he pulled out the sealed envelope that contained his wife's final testament. The husband barely listened to the lawyer's formalities, his mind wandering to the mansion he assumed would soon be officially his. He would retain control, he reassured himself. Everything she had built, all of their assets, would pass on to him, as was expected. His thoughts drifted to their shared history, the good times and the bad. Despite everything, this was his rightful inheritance. The lawyer cleared his throat, drawing the husband's attention back to the present. With a slow, deliberate motion, the envelope was opened, the crackle of paper filling the room. The reading began, the usual clauses and legal jargon flowing smoothly until the air suddenly shifted. The lawyer paused. "And to my child, whom my husband has never acknowledged," the lawyer read, his voice firm but laced with the weight of the revelation, "I leave my entire estate." Silence fell. The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around the husband's neck. He blinked once, twice, as if waiting for the punchline of a cruel joke. His wife had known. She had known all along about the child he had fathered with his mistress. And now, in her death, she had set the final stage for his downfall. What is this?" The husband sputtered, his voice cracking. He looked to his mistress, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't expected this either. The lawyer continued, without pause, detailing the specifics of the will, but the husband heard none of it. His entire estate, the home, the money, the investments, everything, was now in the hands of a child he had never met. His hands clenched the armrests of the chair, knuckles turning white. Betrayal coursed through him, followed by rage. His wife had orchestrated her revenge from beyond the grave, and he was powerless to stop it. The lawyer finally looked up, meeting the husband's bewildered gaze. "I'm afraid there's nothing you can contest, sir," he said softly. "This is her final testament. The child is the sole heir." The drive back from the notary's office was thick with silence, the tension between the husband and his mistress palpable. The narrow road winding through their affluent neighborhood felt claustrophobic, each turn tightening the coil of emotions simmering beneath the surface. As soon as they entered the house, his house, or so he had believed, the dam broke. The husband slammed the door behind him, his hands trembling with barely contained fury. His mistress stood just inside, her back pressed against the wall, watching him warily. "Did you know?" His voice came out in a low growl, the accusation clear. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. She shook her head, visibly rattled. "No," she whispered, her hands trembling as she held onto her purse, knuckles turning white. "I didn't know she would leave everything to our child. I had no idea." "Liar," he spat, pacing the room like a caged animal. His thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of the bombshell that had been dropped on them. His entire life, everything he had worked for, every security he had built, was now slipping through his fingers. His mistress, sensing the danger in his fury, took a step toward him. "I swear I didn't know," she said more forcefully. "I thought everything would go to you. Why would I want it this way? This isn't good for me either." He stopped pacing, his chest heaving as he glared at her. "You think I believe that?" His words were venomous. "This child was never supposed to be part of this. Do you realize what you've done to me? I didn't do anything." Her voice was rising now, panic creeping into her tone. "You kept this a secret too. We both did. How was I supposed to know she knew? This isn't my fault." He was on her in an instant, grabbing her by the arms and shaking her. "Everything is falling apart because of this. My children, my estate, all of it, gone." His voice cracked under the weight of his anger. He let her go abruptly, pushing her back against the wall. She stared at him, eyes wide and wild. "We can fix this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We just need to figure something out. There has to be a way to contest this. There's always a way." The husband shook his head, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "I'll lose everything," he muttered, half to himself. The mistress, sensing an opening, stepped forward cautiously. "Not if we work together," she suggested softly. "We both have something to lose here. Maybe we can find a way to protect what's ours." The husband met her gaze, the anger in his eyes cooling into something darker, more calculating. She was right. They were in this together now, for better or worse. And as much as he loathed the situation, he couldn't afford to lose. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to think clearly. Maybe there was still a way to turn this around. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and growing anxiety. Word of the wife's will spread quickly through their affluent community. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, and it wasn't long before the husband's legitimate children, his daughters from his marriage, found out about the situation. It started with a phone call. His eldest daughter, Clara, hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. But when she did, it wasn't with grief or condolence. It was with cold, calculated anger. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice sharp over the phone. The husband froze, the receiver pressed to his ear. "Clara, what? Did you father a child with your mistress?" she demanded, cutting him off. His heart sank. It wasn't just the inheritance she was angry about. It was a lie, the decades-long lie that had now come to light. He swallowed hard, knowing there was no use denying it. "Clara, please, it's complicated. I don't want to hear it." Her voice was icy. "You've humiliated us. Do you realize what this is doing to our family?" He could barely find the words to respond. "I never wanted this to happen. It's all a misunderstanding. We can fix it. I can fix it." "No," she said, her tone final. "I'm done with you. Don't call me again." The line went dead, and the phone slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the table. The weight of it all crashed over him like a tidal wave. His daughters, his reputation, the family name, it was all disintegrating. The house, which had once been a symbol of his success, now felt like a crumbling monument to his failures. Meanwhile, the mistress had begun planning. She wasn't one to sit idle while things fell apart. She met with a lawyer, discussing their options. The more she learned, the clearer it became. The child, their child, was now the rightful heir to the entire estate. The husband had no legal claim, unless they could find a loophole, and fast. Tensions between them continued to mount. They had once been partners in their affair, but now they were reluctant allies, bound together by a shared desire to protect themselves. The mistress was increasingly focused on securing her child's future, while the husband's mind raced with thoughts of revenge. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't. As the community distanced themselves from him, whispers grew louder. His wife's final act of revenge was unfolding exactly as she had planned. His legacy was shattered, and with each passing day, the noose around his neck tightened just a little more. The mistress sat in her modest living room, papers spread across the coffee table. She had met with her lawyer earlier that day, and the reality of the situation was starting to crystallize. Her child, the product of years of secrecy, now stood to inherit everything her former lover had built with his late wife. It was a victory of sorts, but it didn't feel like one. Not yet. The house was quiet, save for the occasional sound of the child's footsteps upstairs. They were still processing the news, trying to make sense of their sudden inheritance and the father they had never known. The mistress, however, had no time for sentiment. She had to be smart. The husband was desperate, and she knew desperation could make people dangerous. She picked up her phone and dialed her lawyer again. "We need to move quickly," she said when he answered. "I don't want him finding a way to contest this. My child is the rightful heir, and I want to make sure we're protected." The lawyer assured her they were in a strong legal position, but the mistress knew better than to trust the system completely. The husband had resources, and if anyone could find a way to weasel out of a bad situation, it was him. She needed to control the narrative before he could turn things in his favor. The next morning, the mistress took a bold step. She contacted a local journalist, offering an exclusive interview about the will and the sudden inheritance. The story would cast her as the misunderstood mother, a woman who had struggled in silence while raising a child on her own. It was a narrative designed to gain public sympathy, and it worked. The story hit the press 2 days later. The headline read, "Secret Child Inherits Estate After Widow's Shocking Will Revealed." The article painted a picture of betrayal and secrecy, but the mistress came off as a victim, a woman who had suffered in silence for years. She carefully played the role, portraying herself as someone who had been wronged, but now had a chance to give her child the future they deserved. The husband's fury was immediate. The story only deepened his humiliation, and it was clear now that the mistress wasn't just playing defense. She was on the attack. He realized that she wasn't content with just securing the inheritance. She was planning to use it to elevate herself in the eyes of the public. But she hadn't won yet. The husband still had a few cards to play, and he wasn't about to let her steal everything without a fight. The husband hadn't seen the child since they were a toddler, back when the affair was fresh, and the mistress had believed that maybe, just maybe, they could be a family one day. Now, after years of ignoring the child's existence, he was forced to confront the reality of the situation. The mistress had arranged for the meeting in a neutral place, a small cafe far from prying eyes. The husband sat at a corner table, sipping his coffee nervously as he waited. His mind raced with questions. What would they be like? Did they know everything? Would they resent him? When the child finally arrived, escorted by the mistress, the husband felt a jolt of recognition. The resemblance was undeniable. The teenager stood awkwardly near the door, clearly uncomfortable. The husband waved them over, trying to summon some kind of warmth or paternal instinct, but it felt foreign and forced. The child sat down, glancing from the husband to their mother, and back again. They were quiet, unsure of what to say or how to act. The husband cleared his throat. "I'm sorry about all of this," he started awkwardly. "I didn't want things to happen this way." The child said nothing, their eyes fixed on the table. The husband felt a pang of guilt, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He realized that he didn't know this person at all. They were practically a stranger. The mistress, sensing the tension, stepped in. "I thought it was important for you both to meet," she said softly. "Given everything that's happening, it's time." The child finally looked up, their eyes locking with the husband's. "I didn't ask for any of this," they said, their voice quiet but firm. "I don't even know you." The husband swallowed hard. "I know, and that's my fault." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with all the things that couldn't be said. The husband didn't know how to connect with the child. He didn't know how to explain the years of abandonment, the secrecy, the lies. How could he? But as the meeting dragged on, the husband began to see glimmers of something more. The child wasn't angry. Not exactly. They were confused, hurt, but there was no outright rejection. It was more complicated than that. After an hour, the meeting ended with little fanfare. The child left with their mother, and the husband was left sitting at the table, wondering if this was the beginning of some kind of reconciliation, or just another failure. For the first time, the husband found himself questioning whether the fight for the estate even mattered. He had already lost so much. Perhaps this child, his child, was the last thing he could salvage. The courtroom was cold and sterile, its walls painted a dull gray that mirrored the somber mood inside. The husband sat at the defendant's table, his lawyer whispering strategies into his ear. Across the room, the mistress sat with her own lawyer, her eyes forward focused, with an air of confidence that sent a chill down the husband's spine. This was it. The legal battle over his wife's estate had officially begun. The first few days were filled with procedural formalities, lawyers debating legal precedents and jurisdiction over the will. The husband found it hard to focus. His mind kept wandering to his last meeting with his child. There had been no resolution there, just a quiet, lingering awkwardness. And now, sitting in the courtroom, his fate was in the hands of a legal system that had already been bent in the child's favor. His lawyer, a sharp man in his 40s, assured him that they had a case. There were technicalities they could exploit, loopholes that might give them an edge. But the husband wasn't so sure anymore. His heart wasn't in this fight the way it had been in the beginning. Yes, he wanted his estate back, but what was he really fighting for? Money, property, or something deeper? Something he couldn't quite put into words. The mistress's lawyer was relentless. He painted the husband as a man who had deceived his wife, fathered a child in secret, and now wanted to rob that child of their rightful inheritance. The mistress herself played her part well, stoic, almost serene, as if she were the wrong party in all of this. She had mastered the art of public sympathy, and the media coverage had only made things worse for him. The case dragged on for weeks, with each side presenting their arguments. The husband's lawyer pushed hard on the notion that the wife's mental state in her final years might have been compromised, suggesting that her decision to leave everything to the child might not have been made with full capacity. It was a desperate angle, but it was all they had. Meanwhile, the husband found himself increasingly isolated. His legitimate children had cut ties with him entirely, refusing to speak or even acknowledge his existence. His reputation in the community had been shattered, and he could feel the weight of judgment from those around him. But the worst part wasn't the trial or the gossip. It was the silence that lingered between him and his child. The more he fought, the further he felt from any chance of a relationship with them. Each day in court felt like a step backward, away from the one thing that might still matter. The courtroom was packed the day the major revelation was unveiled. The husband sat tense in his seat, knowing that the next piece of evidence could either save him or doom him entirely. His lawyer had hinted at something big, something that could change the entire course of the trial. But when the revelation came, it wasn't from his side. The mistress's lawyer stood confidently in front of court, holding a sealed letter in his hands. The letter, he explained, was found among the deceased wife's belongings, a final letter she had written before her death, addressed to her husband. The lawyer opened it with deliberate care, the courtroom falling into a hushed silence. "To my husband," the lawyer read aloud, his voice clear and steady. "I know what you've done. I've known for years. But you never expected me to have the last word, did you?" The husband felt his blood run cold. The lawyer continued, reading the letter in full detail. In it, the wife revealed that she had discovered the affair long ago, but had chosen to remain silent. She knew about the child, about the years of lies, and had waited until the perfect moment to exact her revenge. Her decision to leave the estate to the child was not made out of love or duty, but out of a desire to punish the husband for his betrayal. "This is my final act of defiance," the letter concluded. You took everything from me. Now I take everything from you." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the air thick with shock and disbelief. The husband sat frozen, his face drained of color, as the weight of his wife's final words sank in. She had known all along. Every smile, every loving gesture in the years before her death had been a facade, masking the seething resentment she had harbored. And now, from beyond the grave, she had delivered her final blow. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. The husband's lawyer quickly tried to downplay the letter's significance, arguing that it was merely an emotional outburst and shouldn't hold legal weight. But everyone in the room knew that the revelation had changed everything. The mistress sat back in her chair, her lips curled into a slight, satisfied smile. The husband turned to look at her, and for the first time, he saw the extent of her triumph. She hadn't just won the legal battle, she had won the personal one, too. His wife had left nothing to chance, and now, the husband was left with nothing. But as the courtroom settled, a different kind of realization began to dawn on him. His wife's revenge was complete, but what did that mean for him now? The battle for the estate had been about pride, about reclaiming something he believed was his. But with this revelation, the illusion of his control was shattered. The wife had taken everything, but she had also given him something: clarity. There was nothing left to fight for. The wealth, the status, the legacy. It was all meaningless now. The only thing that mattered was the child sitting quietly across the room, a child who had been caught in the crossfire of their parents' sins. For the first time since the trial began, the husband felt something close to peace. The fight was over. Now, perhaps, there was room for something else. The days following the reading of the letter were a blur for the husband. He had never felt so powerless, so utterly exposed. His wife's final words had cut deeper than he had expected, and now, the full weight of her revenge was settling in. Everywhere he turned, there were whispers, pointed looks, and judgment. His entire legacy, everything he had built, was falling apart in front of him. At the heart of it all was the child he had spent years ignoring, denying, hiding. And now, they were the key to everything. The husband's attempts to salvage what remained of his estate were faltering. The court battle had already taken its toll on him emotionally, but now, after the revelation, his legal standing was all but crumbling. His lawyer was running out of options, and even the most creative arguments couldn't save him. It wasn't just the court case that was slipping from his grasp. His reputation, once pristine, had been shattered. His legitimate children refused to speak to him, their anger and disappointment hanging like a dark cloud over every interaction. They had been humiliated, and in their eyes, he was to blame for the mess that now surrounded their family name. He wandered the halls of his once grand home, now a place filled with ghosts of the past. Every room, every piece of furniture seemed to remind him of what he had lost. The house, once a symbol of his success, felt more like a prison, a crumbling monument to the life he had ruined. The press coverage was relentless. Each new article painted him as the villain of the story, a man who had cheated on his wife, fathered a child in secret, and now sought to deprive the child of their rightful inheritance. The mistress, on the other hand, had gained even more public sympathy. Her narrative as the wronged woman, raising a child alone while the man she had once loved betrayed her, was playing perfectly into the hands of the media. The story was spun as one of strength and resilience, her standing by her child's side as they claimed what was rightfully theirs. And the child, they were caught in the middle. They had been thrust into a world they didn't fully understand, into a fight they hadn't chosen. The husband hadn't spoken to them since their first meeting, and every day that passed made the distance between them seem insurmountable. He knew he had failed them. He had failed as a father, as a husband, as a man. Everything was unraveling, and there was nothing left to hold on to. One evening, as he sat in the dimly lit study, staring blankly at the legal papers scattered across his desk, the realization hit him. There was no fixing this. His wife's plan had worked perfectly. She had taken everything from him, not just the estate, but his pride, his reputation, his family. And the worst part, she had done it all after she was gone, leaving him to deal with the wreckage alone. For the first time in a long while, the husband felt something other than anger. He felt tired, exhausted from the fight, from the lies, from the weight of everything that had come crashing down around him. He had lost. While the husband's world was falling apart, the child was facing their own internal battle. The inheritance had thrust them into a life they hadn't asked for, a world of wealth, power, and public attention that felt suffocating. They had grown up knowing that their father existed, but never truly being a part of his life. Now, they were the center of a storm they barely understood. Everywhere they went, there were cameras, journalists asking for statements, people prying into their personal life. The press had painted a sympathetic picture of them, a child who had been abandoned, now suddenly given a fortune. But the reality was far more complicated. The money, the estate, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a burden. The child had no relationship with their father, no memories to draw from, no connection beyond the biological. And yet, here they were, inheriting everything that was once his. They hadn't asked for any of this, and now they were being forced to make decisions that would change the course of their life forever. The pressure was immense, and the child didn't know who to turn to for guidance. The mistress, their mother, had been a constant presence, but even she seemed distant now, caught up in the legal proceedings and the media attention. The child could see that their mother was enjoying the victory, enjoying the public support and the wealth that was now within reach. But for the child, it was all too much. They had grown up without their father, and now, suddenly, they were supposed to replace him, to take over his estate, his life, his legacy. One afternoon, while sitting alone in the mansion that now belonged to them, the child stared out the window, lost in thought. They felt like an intruder in this grand, empty house. It wasn't home. It had never been. The more they thought about it, the more they realized they didn't want it. They didn't want the money, the estate, the power. They wanted something else, something they had never had before. A family. The child's thoughts turned to their father. Despite everything that had happened, despite the lies and the distance, there was a part of them that wanted to know him. Not the man who had been portrayed in the press, not the figure who had abandoned them, but the real person, the father they had never had the chance to know. Was that even possible now? The child's heart ached with the weight of the decision they knew they had to make. They could keep the estate, the wealth, and walk away, never looking back. Or they could reach out to their father, try to build something from the wreckage of their broken family. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was one they knew they had to make soon. And deep down, despite the anger, despite the pain, the child knew what they wanted. They wanted a connection. They wanted to understand the man who had been absent for so long. The question was, would he want the same? As the walls of his life continued to close in on him, the husband found himself sitting in his study, surrounded by the remnants of a life that was slipping through his fingers. Legal papers littered his desk, unopened bills piled up in the corner, and the echoes of his children's silence hung in the air like a heavy fog. It was late, and the room was dimly lit by the flickering light of a desk lamp that barely cut through the darkness. He couldn't sleep. He hadn't been able to in weeks. His mind was racing, consumed by thoughts of what he could do to salvage even a shred of what he had lost. His wife's will had left him in ruins, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat, not yet. There had to be something he could do, some desperate move that could turn things around. The phone on his desk rang, jolting him from his thoughts. He hesitated before answering, knowing it was his lawyer calling with the latest updates on the case. He picked up the receiver, bracing himself for more bad news. "We're running out of options," his lawyer said, his tone grave. "The will is ironclad, and the court isn't likely to rule in your favor. The best we can hope for now is a settlement." The husband clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the phone. A settlement, that was all he had left. A desperate attempt to cut a deal with his mistress and child, to salvage whatever he could from the wreckage of his life. He hated the idea of giving up, of admitting defeat, but he knew his lawyer was right. If he didn't make a move now, he would lose everything. The next day, the husband arranged a private meeting with the mistress. They met in the same cafe where he had first met his child, a small, dimly lit place far from the prying eyes of the media. The air between them was thick with tension, neither of them willing to make the first move. Finally, the husband spoke. "We need to talk about a settlement." The mistress raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but cautious. She had won, and she knew it. But there was something in his voice, something in his posture, that told her he wasn't here to beg. He was here to negotiate. "What kind of settlement?" she asked, her voice cool and controlled. "I'm willing to give up most of the estate," he said, surprising even himself with the words. "But I want something in return." The mistress leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "And what would that be?" The husband took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I want a relationship with my child. I want the chance to make things right." For a moment, the mistress was silent, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "And why should I agree to that?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Because it's what's best for them," the husband replied, his tone firm. "You know it, and I know it. They deserve a chance to know their father, to have a real family." The mistress considered his words, her gaze flickering with uncertainty. She had spent years building a life without him, raising their child on her own, and now, after all this time, he wanted to be part of that life. But there was something about the way he spoke, something in his eyes, that made her pause. Maybe he was serious. Maybe, after everything, he was finally ready to be the father he had never been. After a long silence, she nodded. "Fine," she said, her voice softening. "We can work something out, but don't think for a second that this erases everything that's happened." The husband nodded, relief flooding through him. He knew this wouldn't be easy, and he knew he had a long way to go before he could truly make amends. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The courtroom was packed for the final day of the trial, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The media had been following the case closely, and the headlines painted a picture of betrayal, greed, and a family torn apart. The husband sat at the defendant's table, his lawyer by his side, both of them bracing for the outcome. Across the room, the mistress and the child sat together, their lawyer presenting the final arguments. The case had dragged on for weeks, but it all came down to this moment. The husband's lawyer stood to make his closing statement, his voice steady and measured as he laid out their final argument. He appealed to the court's sense of fairness, arguing that the husband, despite his mistakes, deserved some portion of the estate. He emphasized the years of work and dedication the husband had put into building his life, into providing for his family, even if that family had now been fractured. The mistress's lawyer countered with a powerful rebuttal, reminding the court of the husband's betrayal, of the years he had spent hiding the truth. The estate, they argued, rightfully belonged to the child, the one innocent party in all of this. The wife's will was clear, and the court had no reason to overturn it. The husband listened in silence, his heart pounding in his chest. He had made his peace with losing most of the estate, but he still clung to the hope that the court might grant him something, some small victory, some recognition of the life he had built. But more than that, he wanted the chance to reconnect with his child, to make amends for the years he had spent as a distant shadow in their life. When the judge finally spoke, the room fell into a hush. His voice was calm, deliberate, as he read the court's decision. The will, he explained, was legally binding. The estate would go to the child, as outlined in the wife's final testament. However, the judge added, there was room for compromise. The husband would be granted a small portion of this estate, enough to maintain his dignity and provide for himself, but the majority would go to the child. It wasn't the victory the husband had hoped for, but it wasn't a complete loss either. As the judge finished reading the decision, the husband glanced across the room, his eyes meeting his child's for the briefest of moments. There was no anger in their gaze, no resentment, just a quiet understanding that things were changing, that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. The courtroom emptied slowly, the media already buzzing with their next headlines. The husband stood, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his mind strangely clear. The fight was over, and though he hadn't won in the traditional sense, he had gained something far more important, the chance for a new, beginning with his child. The echo of the judge's final ruling still lingered in the husband's ears as he stepped out of the courtroom into the blinding daylight. The crowd of journalists, eager for a statement, swarmed around him like vultures. His lawyer guided him through the throng of reporters, offering Kurt no comments at every question. But the husband barely noticed them. His mind was elsewhere. The court's decision had brought a kind of resolution. The majority of the estate would go to his child, while he would be left with a small portion to maintain his own life. It wasn't the victory he had fought for, but as he walked out into the sunlight, he realized it didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was the future, and the fragile chance at building a relationship with the child he had once ignored. His thoughts were interrupted when he saw the child standing by the courthouse steps, their posture tense, arms crossed as they waited for him. The mistress stood off to the side, her face set in a neutral expression, but there was a look in her eyes that suggested she knew this was no longer her battle. The husband approached cautiously, unsure of how to begin. They hadn't spoken directly since that tense cafe meeting, and the courtroom had only added to the tension between them. But now, standing there in the open air, it felt different, less like a fight and more like an opportunity. The child looked up at him, their expression unreadable. "So that's it?" they asked quietly, their voice carrying a weight of uncertainty. "The estate is mine, and you get, what, a few scraps?" The husband winced at the bluntness, but there was no anger in the child's tone, just confusion. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not about the estate," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "Not anymore. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've been distant. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be there for you now, to make things right." The child looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as if searching for something. Finally, they nodded. "I don't know what that's supposed to look like," they admitted. "But maybe we can figure out." It wasn't a declaration of forgiveness, and it wasn't a promise of a perfect relationship. But it was a start, and that was all the husband could ask for. As they walked away from the courthouse together, the husband felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The fight was over, the estate settled, and though his life would never be the same, he had been given a second chance, a chance he had never thought he'd have. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something close to hope. Months had passed since the courtroom battle, and though the dust had settled, the aftermath was still unfolding. The estate had been formally transferred to the child, and the mansion that had once been the husband's symbol of success was now in the hands of the person he had once abandoned. But things had changed in subtle ways, ways that had nothing to do with money or property. The husband's relationship with his child was tentative at first. Awkward conversations, uncomfortable silences, and the lingering weight of years of absence hung over them like a cloud. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, they began to find common ground. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when it felt like the past would always stand between them. But they kept trying, and that was what mattered. The child had taken to visiting the husband more often, sometimes just to talk, sometimes just to sit in silence. They weren't looking for a father figure, and the husband wasn't trying to be one, not in the traditional sense. But they were building something new, something neither of them had anticipated. It was a relationship based on honesty, on the understanding that they couldn't change the past, but they could decide how to move forward. One afternoon, as they sat together in the small garden behind the husband's modest new home, the child turned to him, their expression thoughtful. "Do you ever regret it?" they asked quietly. The husband knew what they meant. He paused, considering his words carefully. "I regret the way things happened," he said after a moment. "I regret not being there for you when I should have been, but I don't regret trying to make it right now." The child nodded, their gaze distant as they stared out at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "I guess that's all we can really do, right? Try to make things better." "Yeah," the husband agreed. "That's all we can do." There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes with understanding, with the quiet acknowledgement of progress. The husband's life was different now. He no longer had the wealth, the status, or the power that had once defined him. His former social circles had abandoned him, and his legitimate children still refused to speak to him. But in losing everything, he had found something he hadn't even realized he was missing: the chance to be a father, to build a relationship that wasn't based on lies or secrets, but on a shared desire to move forward. The child stood, stretching their arms as they prepared to leave. "I'll come by again next week," they said casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Maybe we can grab lunch or something." The husband smiled. "I'd like that." As the child walked away, the husband sat back in his chair, watching them go. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the garden, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. His life had taken a path he never could have predicted, and though it had been filled with pain, betrayal, and loss, it had led him to this moment, a moment of quiet redemption. He had lost his fortune, his reputation, and the family he had once built. But in the end, he had gained something far more valuable: the chance to start over, the chance to make things right. And for that, he was grateful. Hey, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. We'd love to hear what part of the story had the most impact on you. Was it the final twist, the emotional journey, or something else? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. Also, if there's a story you'd love to see us cover, leave your suggestions in the comments. We're always looking for new ideas and would love to bring your favorite stories to life. Thanks for watching and supporting the channel.